Welcome to the Business of Story podcast. Today, we have a very special guest joining us, Dr. Randy Olson. Randy is a renowned filmmaker and scientist who has developed a revolutionary storytelling framework called the ABT narrative. This framework helps businesses and individuals craft compelling stories by simplifying complex information into a clear and concise narrative structure. So get ready to learn how to captivate your audience and communicate your message effectively with Dr. Randy Olson on the Business of Story podcast. Well, did that sound like my typical opening or maybe a bit more robotic? It was written in milliseconds by ChatGPT when I prompted it by asking it to write a 30-second script to introduce Dr. Randy Olson and the ABT narrative framework for my Business of Story podcast. Then I asked the AI to add a 30-second paragraph on what Randy thinks the impact ChatGPT might have on his ABT narrative framework training. Here's what it offered up. In addition to his impressive background in storytelling, Randy is also a strong advocate for using technology to enhance the way we communicate. With the advent of language models like ChatGPT, Randy believes that the ABT narrative framework can be further amplified by incorporating AI technology to streamline and automate the story creation process. By leveraging the power of AI, businesses and individuals can generate high-quality stories faster and more efficiently than ever before. So let's hear what Randy has to say about the future of storytelling with AI on the Business of Story podcast. Well, it's pretty solid, except it makes one glaring error. Randy does not consider himself so much of a storytelling guru as he does one of the leading coaches and teachers on narrative form, starting with the ABT. So let me fill in the blanks that the robot missed.
Does not compute. Does not compute.
Today, we are going to discuss the massive shakeup GPT is making in science, academia, business, and in society. Is this an obstacle or opportunity, friend or foe, of the ABT? What makes story content and form dramatically different, and why you need to know the difference if you're going to be effective with ChatGPT and in your own communications. We'll also look at how this amazing AI is just simply the latest expression of natural selection and how you can use it to quickly create variations on your communications so you can select which one you believe will have the greatest impact in the noisy wilds out there. And we're going to show you a ChatGPT in action as it attempts to decipher an ABT. Turns out you really have to know where you're going and what you want if you're going to put ChatGPT to work for you. So is ChatGPT friend or foe of the ABT build? Well, let's find out with my good friend, Dr. Randy Olson, on the Business of Story. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the Business of Story. Randy Olson, welcome back for the umpteenth time. You have a terrific agent, by the way.
Oh, really? I haven't. Where's my paychecks in that case?
Well, yeah, check with your agent on that one. For those of you that don't know my relationship with Randy, I met him over a decade ago now. It was September of 2013. He had just come out with his second book, Connection. And in it, I was reading the galleys he had sent over just before he was going to press with it. We did not know each other. His agent apparently sent it. And I read it, and I was really amazed by it, especially the and, but, therefore. As you know, me being in the branding, advertising, marketing world for 35 plus years now, to me, when I saw this ABT unit, it was like, is this the holy grail of what I've always been looking for? To make a complex message simple and easily digestible for all of our audiences, prospects, customers, colleagues, you name it. And then the more I studied, the more I learned from Randy about it, and the more work we've actually done together, he in the science and academic world and me translating that in the business world, and then Randy and I sharing the highs and lows of our trainings, and even being in the trainings together, we have learned so much in this process. And again, the ABT is something I wished I had learned in the third grade. It is simply that powerful. But today, what we are being inundated to, no surprise, is this question about ChatGPT, AI. What is it going to do to our content creation, our storytelling, And especially, Randy, you've heard from a few people of, look at this thing's going to take over your whole training of the ABT. You should really be worried about that. And so we're going to look at that today. Is ChatGPT friend or foe to the ABT? With that, Randy, where did this really hit you? The ABT and the GPT and FYI, ASAP, any other acronym I can throw in there?
We'll see if I sound terrified or not. That remains to be determined. Let me start with, we got lots to go through here, and I think we're going to have a discussion that's going to wind its way through 5 different parts. So let's start with part 1. And given that this is a podcast known as The Business of Story, let me begin with a little story for you. So it's going to seem a little off topic, but I promise you I'll bring it around and relate it to what we're here to discuss. I want to tell you a story of about 30 years ago, and the most important moment in my professional life when I made my move out of the academic world. I walked away from a tenured professorship of marine biology and had gotten deeper interested in communication and filmmaking in general. Therefore, I decided to go to film school at the University of Southern California. And as I say, resigned from the professorship, moved to Los Angeles. And in January of 1994, showed up here, got myself a very cool apartment in Beechwood Canyon. It was kind of half of a little stucco house just below the Hollywood sign in Hollywood. 2 weeks after I moved in, the Northridge earthquake hit. 6.8 on the Richter scale. 57 people were killed in it. It was gargantuan. And it's been almost 30 years now, so I hope it's okay for me to tell this story. But my experience with the Northridge earthquake was something I will never, ever forget, which is the night before the earthquake, I'd gone out to dinner with a woman I'd just begun dating, and we ended up drinking a couple bottles of wine and sleeping together that night for the first time ever. And basically at 4:30 in the morning, I made the earth move for her. When the earthquake
oh boy,
hit.
I was wondering where you're going with that.
Exactly. So sorry about that. But here's what happened. I woke up in a dead sleep, and she was born and raised in Los Angeles, so she knew what to do for an earthquake. And so she had grabbed the blankets off the bed and was trying to hold them up over the headboard because there was a big window there that she was afraid was going to burst and shower glass all over us. But I grew up in Kansas, and I had no earthly idea what was happening. It was deafening thunder. The earthquake itself went for almost a minute or so, everything just shaking violently back and forth. And I have no recollection of what happened, but she filled me in a few hours later, which is that I sat up, knocked her arms down, and apparently grabbed her by both biceps and began shaking her, shouting, oh my God, over and over again. And the proof of that, she showed me later that morning, she had light bruising on both biceps from I grabbed her so hard.
Oh, the valor.
Moral of the story is don't come anywhere near me if there's an earthquake about to happen. But what did take place in the weeks and months after that was devastation of the city. I mean, just everybody was shaken to their core out of nowhere, all within a few minutes time. And I tell that because that's the perfect analogy for what has taken place so far with ChatGPT. And that's our starting point, is that it's an earthquake, whether you're aware of it or not. So it began with some tremors. It was released by OpenAI last November, very quietly. And they just decided, I guess, let's get it out there and see what happens with people. In mid-December, the New York Times had an article about how you could use it to write an essay basically at the level of a fourth grader, and it was kind of lightly humorous. But by a month later, on January 16th, on the front page of the New York Times was a very serious article that, do you have the headline of that in that email I'd sent you there? But
alarmed by AI chatbots, universities start revamping how they teach. And then with the next one was, with the rise of the popular new chatbot ChatGPT, colleges are restructuring some courses and taking preventative measures.
Exactly. And within days of that, there were articles in the Chronicle of Higher Education, 2 of them that were sent to me by a friend with the headlines basically, don't panic, because everybody's panicking at the universities, which is that overnight it suddenly became really easy for students to cheat. And then a few weeks later, South Park came out with their episode on ChatGPT that was all about that, all the kids in the school cheating. And then the the teacher, Mr. Garrison, is, geez, why am I getting these 20-page perfect essays on history? I don't have the time to grade these. And his boyfriend tells him, well, just feed them into ChatGPT and it'll grade them for you. And basically everybody in the town ends up cheating on everybody else as a result of it. It's a great episode to just show you what potentially can go on. And one of the biggest punches comes at the end of that episode, which is it ends by cutting to the credit, and it says written by Trey Parker and ChatGPT. And just this past week, Variety reported on the Writers Guild is coming out with a new set of rules to allow people to cite ChatGPT as a co-author. There has to be a human involved with any screenwriting credit or whatever. But that's where the state of the situation is at the moment. So what happened in the wake of that article in the New York Times was 3 different friends of mine sent me almost kind of schadenfreude emails about, well, I guess that's it for you and your storytelling workshops. Well, there's the first clue that they didn't know what they were talking about, which is I don't teach storytelling workshops. I teach something called narrative training that we have developed over the past decade. We labeled it story circles for 5 years as we were grading our way into it actually becoming purely narrative training. And what we mean by the word narrative is the basic 3-part structure of setup, problem, solution. That's at the core of communication. That's at the core of everything that we train. And if you think that we're teaching storytelling, you don't even know what we do. And if you think that all we do is 3 words and but therefore, you clearly haven't read the books and you don't know. And that's all fine. You don't need to know what we do, but don't try and write me an email saying, well, I guess that's the end of your training. But that did sort of wake me up as well. That was my form of the earthquake. Like, what is going on here? And then you start looking at it. But actually, there's a bigger picture element to it, which is that I've had this mentor in my journey through Hollywood for 30 years. Mike Backus, who I'd met just before I moved here 30 years ago. And you've had him on your podcast early on as a guest, a tremendous guy. He worked with Dr. Michael Crichton, the author of Jurassic Park, early on 30 years ago when I first met him. He wrote the screenplays for 2 of Crichton's novels and had a video game company with him. They were partners. And is a very, very smart guy who eventually made his way into the subject of medical marijuana. And he's now one of the world's experts. His book is one of the most popular books on medical marijuana, cannabis pharmacy. And we've stayed close friends over the years. And he's given me a great deal of guidance along the way in terms of making sense of this insane Hollywood culture. And one of the most important things began 5 years ago, in 2018, when he started forcing me to read about artificial intelligence, saying, trust me. And he's friends with people that are in the very heart of the whole AI movement. From his whole background, he also was a special effects expert on lots of big budget movies, on Spider-Man, things like that. And so he's always been a conduit into that world. And he began warning me, this is what's coming, and you'd better start educating yourself on it. And there were 2 books in particular in 2018 that he had me read, which for all of you, I just asked him recently, what's the newest best books? And he said, those are still kind of the 2 definitive works in his opinion. First one was Our Final Invention by James Borat. And that was a bestseller. It came out 10 years ago, actually, 2013, and yet really wasn't that widely talked about. And the second was Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark. If you read those 2 books, you start to get the big picture of where things are moving towards. And they sort of predicted that things would start to happen like this. There would be earthquakes. And sure enough, when this started, in mid-January, that came out in the New York Times, I looked at it like, there it is, and ended up on the phone with Mike. And he was saying, this is what I've been telling you. You've got to start learning about, because it's coming. Things are going to be changing rapidly, and they are. And that's it. So that moves us then to our second part of this journey we're going to take here, which is obstacle or opportunity, friend or foe, as you've said.
I think it might be interesting too, Randy, before we jump into this real quick, the fact that you mentioned South Park, Matt Stone and Trey Parker, and where the and but therefore kind of came from your aha moment as being a big time South Park fan and watching that one little clip from that film, 6 Days to Air, where they talk about structure, right?
Exactly. And what had happened for me was I went to film school, made films for about 20 years, and then circled back to the science world and wrote a first book called Don't Be Such a Scientist, in which I laid out all the and people got a big kick out of it, and it got great reviews in Science and Nature and things like that, and sold lots of copies. But after a while, people began sniping at it a little bit, saying, nice book, but all you did was criticize the science world for communication. You didn't give us any solutions. And I began to realize they're right. It was a critique of this is how bad science communication is. And I began searching for, what can I find for prescriptions on how to address this problem? What actions? And the biggest chapter in that book had been Don't Be Such a Poor Storyteller. And then in 2011, as you mentioned, this documentary came out on Comedy Central, and in there on the two South Park guys and how they create the show. And in there, Trey Parker mentioned this simple little rule of replacing. He said, we read over the script, and every time we see the word and, we ask ourselves, could you replace that and with a but or a therefore? Every time you do that, the storytelling gets more interesting. I'd never heard that, despite my years of film school and the 5 writing courses that I had there. But eventually I started researching it. And what I did track it all the way back to was 1986. Frank Daniel, who was the great screenwriting guru at USC Film School. And I was there, and I was lucky enough to have his script analysis course the year before he passed away. But in 1986, in a speech, he had talked about this basic dynamic. And he had said, when we write creatively, but it's really all writing, we always go through this basic 2-part process. The first part is we begin with the first draft and inevitably fall into the dreaded and then structure. That's what you do. You lay out everything that happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. It's in the revisions that we go back in and replace the and thens with buts and therefores. And that's that rule of replacing that somebody eventually derived from that. But that seems to be the bottom line, is that it all tracks back to Frank Daniel. And then you can jump back much further to a time when people could think much more clearly than today. The great philosophers of the 1700s who already identified this 3-part structure that they called the Hegelian dialectic and the triad. And that knowledge was there. It just has been buried over the last century by too much information. And that's a lot of what we do nowadays with this training we're doing. I feel like we're digging down through these layers of information that our society's produced and finding these gems that have been there all along, of which the ABT is the ultimate gem. And more importantly than the ABT, which is the 3 words and but therefore, the more important thing is what those embody, the 3 forces of narrative, which are agreement. This is how we begin effective communication, is what we can agree on. Then secondly, contradiction. This is what activates the brain as soon as you change directions with the word but or however. And then the third part is consequence, what you move forward to, which is the therefore or so. So this is what we're going to do as a result of that. So and that's one of the things that
you and I come across a lot in our training. Very smart people working through their communications, they get locked in this non-narrative and. When I'm presenting or we're doing a workshop and I ask them, can you raise your hand? How often do you find yourself going and this and that and this? And they all look at each other and they kind of smile and they basically say every single time. And what the ABT does is creates that form versus content. This is the form of your content that becomes narrative of setup, problem resolution, or as you said, agreement, contradiction, and consequence.
And the first time I ever gave a big talk on it, to 1,000 scientists in the beginning of 2012, several of them came up afterwards and said, we've been giving and talks for years. We didn't know there was anything wrong with it. You have to have somebody point out that there's a better way of doing things. Otherwise, you're complacent. And this is good enough. And there's still the vast majority of people in the science world are still more than happy with the and form and not interested in listening to this idea that there's a better way to do it. But that's okay. We're making so much progress these days with what we're doing with the training program that you've been a part of now for 3 years, that I am spending less and less time bitching, basically, I think, because we're having so much fun with it. So
is GPT an obstacle or an opportunity for these?
There you go. Okay. So part 2 of what we're going to go through here, obstacle or opportunity. And that is a fundamental question. I've spent 2 months thinking it through intensely, reading about it, talking with people. And at least for now, I've come to the conclusion that it is really a big opportunity for what we're doing with the ABT. It's a new resource that just, as one of my friends said, if you've been using a handsaw for years and years and suddenly somebody comes along with a power saw, wouldn't you use it? Wouldn't you pick it up? Why not? It might not be perfect. You got to be careful. It might chop your fingers off if you don't use it right, but it's an advancement. And that's exactly the way I look at ChatGPT right now, is it's a power saw that's coming along like, wow, we can do things really powerful that we couldn't before. And that's where it's a big opportunity. And that's where we need to dive into some detail now on how is it that it's an opportunity. So let's move quickly then to the third part, which gets a bit more challenging. And this is at the core of communication, which is communication can basically be broken into two parts. You've got the content of what you want to communicate. That's your information. That's your knowledge, your message, your expertise, what you want to say to an audience. And then the second part is you've got the challenge of the shape of it, the form. How are you going to put that information together in a way that won't bore or confuse the audience? And that's what this ABT thing is about. So it's all about form. And this is the reason why now we do this training. And as you know, we have 5 books on the ABT framework that are separate books for the one with you on business, the one with Doug Passon on law, the one with Dave Gold on, and there we go, politics. And then the one that we just released last fall for science postdocs and graduate students in particular with Marvelous Douglas and Keisha Barr, who you had on as guests. And that one's for science. And what's happened to me in the past 10 years with the ABT is that I've been brought into a wide range of different groups of topics that I have no knowledge at all about their content. So astronomers, we did a round of the course with them, physicists, with accountants, with mathematicians, with on and on.
The FAA.
The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, their Aviation Flight Research Center, which has done several rounds of the course and are huge fans of the ABT. And with each of those groups, I begin the whole course with them by saying, look, I can't help you at all on your content. I am of no value to you. If you want me to explain how the nuts and bolts work in your aircraft, I'm useless. I'm not here to work with you on your content. That's your area of expertise. I'm only here to work with you on form, how you're going to put your information together. And it turns out that anybody who's trained in this language of the ABT framework can be of help to you because they can spot these basic elements of your setup, what your problem is, and what the actions are that you're doing. And they can help you shape that to get it to a really efficient, effective form that will then work with people and won't bore them, won't confuse them, and will actually activate their brains and make them interested in what you have to do. Does it work? Part of the problem with the academic science world is that so many of the academic scientists won't touch anything until there's published peer-reviewed research on it to prove that it actually works. I mean, literally, they will sit there not believing in something until they can see a journal that's accepted it in published form, which was great. Well, first off, I mean, that's nice for research science. But communication is different. The world is changing rapidly. And the science world, by the way, is under attack now by this massive anti-science movement that I've watched grow throughout my entire life. And they don't grasp the enormity of the anti-science movement that's come together. And so time is of the essence. And that's what we're going to converge on this discussion is time is absolutely essential. It's the most important variable in all this stuff. It's the central variable in narrative. When you're telling a story, well-told story involves time at its core, reaching the past, present, and future, beginning, middle, and end. It's all moving forward through time. And so time is so crucial on this. And this is what the ABT framework helps you is get a good structure for that. And we're at the point now where I don't have the time to do double-blind controlled studies to prove that it works. The only proof we have is we're now in the 35th round of this course. We're now running the training with the World Bank, with Genentech, with Pfizer, with, on and on, major foundations. And that's the biggest validation possible. And we've done all that with no advertising. There's no hyping of the stuff. It's just word of mouth. People do the training and start talking to people.
And in the business world, Randy, it's all about ROI, return on investment. And I have people every day now sending me their LinkedIn posts and their Instagram posts and said, oh my God, I've never gotten 60,000 engagements before. This ABT thing's a freak show. How does it work exactly? Or I just landed a $250,000 piece of business because I reframed how I made my presentation using an ABT that got me super focused. And it was so easy for the customer to make a decision. I've got accounts that will show that we have grown by 600% because of this thing. I've got another one that says our LinkedIn campaigns have grown in engagement by 400%. And we didn't rewrite the content. We reordered the content using the and, but, therefore, everything. They might make the mistake of starting with the problem, or they might have made the mistake of just and, or the big time mistake of always putting themselves at the center of the story versus their customer that the ABT makes you think about put at the center of the story. So I've got real ROI that your science folks will poo-poo, but the business world says this thing really, really works.
Yeah, but where's your double-blind controlled experiments to prove that it works? I'm not going to listen to you. You know, I want to publish. Send me one published paper that you've gone into a laboratory and actually gathered the data. You know, that's what you run into. And at some point, the real world is advancing too rapidly. And tragically, you can now see the price that the academic world is paying by having that as the constraint, which is that the pandemic hit and the biomedical establishment made a disaster out of communicating around the pandemic and is still in the midst of a disaster in which they're not taking any clear new approaches to fix this mess. That goes on and on. We've talked about that plenty. At any rate,
let's go back to your buddies over at South Park, because we're really talking about content and form right here. And they sum it up the best, do they not?
Yes. Okay. So exactly. So in 2015, when I published my book, Houston, We Have a Narrative, which was really the manifesto laying out the ABT framework. And in there, I'd written a chapter where I credited them. And I said, you know, a lot of this idea, this material came from the two co-creators of South Park and that little thing they did on Comedy Central. And turns out my buddy, Mike Backus, knows Matt Stone and was trading emails with him at the time. And so he said, you know what, send me that chapter. I'll send it to Matt and, you know, they'll be flattered, I hope, you know, that you've cited them like this. And sure enough, Matt wrote him back a really nice email. And in there, to kind of paraphrase what he said, was this one paragraph that I use in talks a lot. You know, had him ask him if it was okay to excerpt that because it's so profound. And what he says is that from the very beginning, he and his creative partner, Trey Parker, we realized that structure, meaning this form stuff we're talking about, what he says verbatim is that structure is so important and so hard to get right. And that said everything right there, which was that he used the word so about the fact that it's important. But then when he came to how hard it is to get it right, he had two so's. It's so hard to get right. What that means is that you can throw together first draft of structure, and that's what the beginning level of the ABT is nice, but therefore you can use that and instantly come up with the first draft, but you don't have it right yet. There's so much more to it, and this is what we've fleshed out in the 35 rounds of the course and the 5 books and the model that we've developed. And we now talk about there being 2 levels to this model. There's the primary level, which is the 3 words. You can learn those instantly. Right now, if you're listening to this, you've already pretty much got the primary level down. But therefore, you know, I took a trip and we had some fun, but we had a flat tire. Therefore, we spent the rest of the trip fixing the tire. There's your ABT story and the core of your story, you know, you might want to tell. So you can get that down in an instant, but that's not very powerful. There is much more power to be had from it. And that parallels back to what he was saying about so hard to get right. And when you start to get it right, that's when it starts to become powerful. And that's what we work on for the 10 1-hour sessions in the course, because there are these sub elements within the and, within the but, within the therefore. And that's where it starts to get a little more detailed. But when you start to get those sub elements right, that's when it becomes really powerful. And so what he then said was that we figured out early on, it's so hard to get right. But when you do get it finally right, then, and this is pretty much what he said, then all you have to do is add the dick jokes and the poop stuff and voila. And that's the actual punchline at the end of it.
Content.
That's it. That's what he's saying. The content's the easy part. You know your content. That is the easy part of communication. This is where the scientists run amok. You know, they think, well, it's so important. We get every little detail right. I know, but if you don't get the form right, people can literally get your entire overall message upside down backwards and get it wrong or be confused or bored or whatever. Yeah. So again, this has been the big challenge. 2 parts, content versus form. Content's the easy stuff. Form is the hard stuff. This is what the ABT helps with. Now, the reason that ChatGPT is really an opportunity and a gift, basically, is that it now gives you the ability to address that form part and come up with rapid iteration, rapid drafts. You can start to use it to take shots at the drafts of your ABT as you work to get it right. As you revise and revise and revise, and you now do this, now do this, now do this. That's the creative process. You come up with this first draft, just as Frank Danielle had said back then. Then you go in and you begin revising. And this becomes a question, like anybody listening to this who's ever written anything, you always face that question. How many drafts am I going to do of this thing? And some people do 50 or 100 drafts of an essay or something. Some do one or two. But that's what you're doing with those drafts. You're revising, trying to get it right, exactly what he had said in that quote. So now that's our third part on content versus form. Let me go off on a little bit of a tangent and parallel here. The fourth part, which is what resonates deep inside of me. And this has to do with my background. My PhD was in evolutionary biology. And I was lucky enough to do my PhD at Harvard University and spend time around Stephen Jay Gould, who was the greatest communicator of evolution, I believe, ever. I think he's was a better communicator of evolution science than Charles Darwin in his time. The essays that he wrote for 25 years in Natural History magazine, he had a monthly column called This View of Life, which is a phrase taken from The Origin of Species from Charles Darwin, was spectacular. And especially the collections of those essays that were edited down into much more readable form, starting with Ever Since Darwin. And so many aspects of this mechanism, this brilliant mechanism that Charles Darwin discovered of evolution by means of natural selection. And I was a teaching assistant twice in the intro bio course in which Gould taught 1/3 of it. And so he presented this basic understanding of evolution by means of natural selection. And what he always said over and over again was, look, natural selection is a very simple process at its core. It consists of two parts, and that's it. The first part is variation. The second part is selection. The way that it works is you've got a population of a species. They all reproduce. And when they reproduce, they generate a lot of variation, tall ones, small ones, skinny ones, everything else like that. And then the second part is the environment goes to work with the selection process, and that's survival of the fittest. And out of all that variation, then whatever the environment favors is what's going to start surviving differentially. And that's the beginning of the changing of the genes inside of the genes are different inside the ones that are, being selected for. And over time, when you iterate that over and over again, he always talked about it as being a ratcheting mechanism that just keeps ratcheting over and over. Step one, step two, step one, step two, variation, then selection, variation, then selection. Well, that's the same thing we're talking about here with the creative process. And it's the same thing of trying to find the narrative core of what it is you want to say. And so that's what you're doing is you're taking a shot at a draft. That's more variation. And then you look at it with a critical eye. You give it to your friends to look at. And they perform that selection process. They go, what's good on this part, but this part's got a problem. Then you go back and give it another shot. And all that stuff takes time. And that's the burden there. That's exactly what Matt Stone had said. It's so important, yet so hard to get right, meaning you've got to go through lots and lots of drafts. Well, now comes this new piece of machinery that can give you those drafts in literally 1 second. You ChatGPT, you type in instructions, you give it, a command, do this for me. And first off, it will do it instantly for you. And then secondly, it turns it into you can turn it into a conversation, which you can modify it as you go along. Okay, now that we got that, now let's tweak this. Okay, now that we've done that, let's tweak that. And that's what I did just a couple days ago, which was to run through this with, last Tuesday in the round of our course that we're doing with the U.S. Forest Service. And a lot of what we're doing there is about fire management and preparation for the upcoming fire season. And that's really, it's a life or death situation with them. They are one of the best groups we've ever worked with because they brought with them urgency. And that turns out to be a very important part of this process is the people that really have something pressing, which I would hope in your business world, a lot of your clients, they've got life or death with whether or not their companies
It's all
survive.
urgency. And it's, Randy, give me something I can use right now. I don't need to dive into a whole bunch of theory. A little bit of theory goes a long way for your narrative intuition, but show it to me in action. Of course, that's why we call the ABT the storytelling dumbbell, because you can literally flex it, curl it in all your messaging and start building on that narrative intuition. But you need to know what you're looking for, don't you? You and I over the past decade now have been kind of teaching this in an analog way in that you and I and Matt and the rest of the team of ours, we get to work with people either in person or virtually. They literally type out, share their ABTs, and then we build them live with the group real time, and we're able to coach them through. So I kind of think of that as like an analog approach to teaching this. And now you've got ChatGPT in there freaking everybody out because, oh my God, the robots are going to take this over. But they discount the human element of you actually have to understand and know how the ABT works if you are going to give the ChatGPT the right prompts to help you. And then the one other point I want to really underscore that I loved you told me about before is this whole idea of natural selection, and creativity, that we are just simply using that GPT to speed up the pace of our variants, right?
Yes.
And actually reduce the energy that we have to do to build those. Let's let them send me, 15, 20, 30 variants of the ABT, but we have to know what we're looking for if we're going to be able to use those, if we're going to find the selection and choose that one that's just right, that is going to survive the onslaught of communication.
And let's take one more second on the natural selection side of things, which is something, what's her name? Gounder, I forgot her first name, but one of the top epidemiologists was on a podcast a couple of weeks ago. And she said something I wasn't aware of, which is, do you realize that right now, all of the COVID virus in the entire world now is all the Omicron variant? All those first variants that wiped out, millions of people, Alpha and Beta and Delta and all that sort of stuff, they've all gone extinct now. They're gone from the planet. It's all Omicron now. This is what she was saying. And that's how rapidly natural selection does take place in viruses compared to humans. And, evolution in humans is very, very slow because our generation time is much, much longer. But with a virus, they're constantly mixing up their information. And as a result, that's what drives change, is how rapidly you can generate that sort of variation. And this is what you're saying there, is that this is what ChatGPT can do for you now, is it can speed the process up. You can do these rapid iterations. There's one other little thought that just came to mind, as we're having this conversation, which is one of the things that is hitting us now. We've run the course with 35 groups. And basically, I wish we had the time and resources and some big foundation supporting. There's no foundation supporting what we're doing. This is all negative financed. Each group pays for the training, and that's it. That's the whole funding source that we've got. But if only there were a foundation that wanted to study these 35 rounds of the course, because it's like we've got a big experiment we've done. Nobody's ever done an experiment like this before. We've got over 1,000 graduates of the course. But we're at a point now, I realized that I can step back and look at these different groups and put them on something I call the urgency spectrum. And at the far end, we've got the Forest Service wrapped up in this life or death situation. If they don't communicate well on these fires that are breaking out in this upcoming fire season, people will die. And that's happened. And I know all too well because my house burned down 4 years ago in fire in the region that I live in. And so their work is very, very urgent. As I'm saying, a lot of your business clients, it's very urgent because their business they're going to live or die themselves on whether their business survives. But some of these scientists that we work with, some of them have no urgency at all. They've got big government funding. They're doing stuff that nobody else is qualified to be able to do. For example, a group of astronomers that we ran the course with, and they were wonderful people doing incredible research, but, on things like galactic nuclei, and they just didn't have any urgency at all. Whether or not we know exactly what the gas composition is on the fourth moon of some planet is not a life or death situation. And as a result, some of them, I think, don't even want to be constrained on this by this idea that you need to know what you're looking. They don't want to know what they're looking for. They're just looking all around because they're curious about everything. That's great. Yeah. But for most of the rest of us out in the real world, we do usually know what, we're wanting to build a business that's going to be successful. And then that's what tracks it back then to this situation with ChatGPT. It can be very valuable, provided you know what you're looking for.
We're going to look at that one. Let's pull one up.
All right. So now it's time for part 5, which is our demo. And this is what we did last week in the course. So we're going to
as you're pulling that up too, Randy, I just want to let folks know, I will often call the ABT the Agile narrative framework for business, because as Randy had said earlier, it's about time. It's about speed. And I'm a big believer in speed to impact. And with our attention economy, that is so difficult in this day and age. But with the right ABT, you put it through a chatbot, you work through that natural selection process. You may look up to 30 different variants on it and find the one that's just right. You are playing Mother Nature here. You are selecting it, and then you're putting it out in the wild to see how it plays. It also helps you set up for ABT testing really well. So, Randy, let's take a look at how you use ChatGPT with your Forest Service group and what you found in the process.
Okay, so what we have here is a series of commands that I put into ChatGPT. And for the sake of timing, I'm going to show you the transcript of what came out. But suffice it to say that when you hit return on these commands, it instantly spits this out. So the first thing I asked it was, using Randy Olson's ABT framework, summarize the current problem of fire suppression in the Western US. And here's what it answers. Sure, I'd be happy to help with that. According to Randy Olson's ABT, yada, yada. So it gives you the three elements of and, but, and therefore. And here's the first one that we're going to really focus in on, is just the and part, the setup. So here's what it says. Wildfires have become increasingly common and severe in the Western U.S., posing a significant threat to human lives, property, and ecosystems. Recent decades, there's been a growing emphasis on suppressing fires quickly through aggressive firefighting tactics, such as heavy use of aircraft and ground crews. Okay, that's a good start. And this is what we're talking about, which is now you have to start in on this process of revision and interactively. And if you're doing this by hand, it might take you another 20 minutes or half an hour to start thinking through, okay, how do I want to rewrite this thing? But what ChatGPT allows you to do is it will instantly give you another shot at it. So here's what I did. So the problem of what it gave us here, there's a lot of problems with it, but the very first one is that you don't want to start an ABT with your problem, with what's going wrong. You want to begin with agreement. You want to ideally, and this is where if you read the most recent version of the book, one we released last fall, start on chapter 3, we talk about the MAT template. And that's the idea of starting off with a vision, a dream of heaven, what you want the world to look like, your expectations before you start giving us the bad news. And so it didn't do that. It started off with the bad news. Wildfires become increasingly common and severe. That's not where we want to start. Okay, so now step 2, I then tell it, okay, now revise the and element to be more optimistic. So it says, sure, I can do that. And what it's given us now is it says, the Western U.S. is home to a diverse range of ecosystems, communities that have evolved alongside fire for millennia. While wildfires can be destructive, they also play a crucial role in maintaining healthy ecosystems by clearing out dead vegetation and promoting new growth. Moreover, there's a growing recognition among policymakers and the public that a more balanced approach to fire management is needed. Actually, that's getting into the problem again there at the end, but most of that first stuff did exactly what I asked. Okay, it made it a little more optimistic. So because I know this model, because we've developed it in the past 10 years, I know where to guide this thing to start doing the work and making it better. I know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a form that matches what we know is the optimum, and it doesn't know it right now, and it ain't going to know it for a good long while. Now we take that one and tweak it a bit more. And I say, now revise the and element. Basically that was kind of close to good enough. So here's our third command, revise the and element using the if-then clause to describe a successful future. This is getting into the secondary level. This is what you learn in the training in the course, is the power of all these other kind of sub-tools, namely this if-then clause is super duper important because it helps you paint a picture of the future of expectations and where we want to go. So now here's what it outputs for the and. It revises it. It says, if the Western U.S. embraces a new approach to fire management that recognizes the ecological importance of fire and balances suppression efforts with prescribed burning and other strategies, then the region can look forward to a future where wildfires are less destructive and more manageable. So that's the right kind of material we want to try and sketch out a optimistic vision of the future before we drop the but bomb on you, which is but. That's not what we're doing today. The problem now is that it's gone and started your and material with the if then. That's not the right place for it. Again, if you know the model, you know that, wait, we want the if then to come right at the end of the and material, right before the but. And so now I give it the next command, which is, okay, now revise the and element, starting it with the optimistic statement, then adding the if then material after that. So it made the mistake of starting with the if then. I'm telling it, put it after the optimistic part. And that's what it does. Sure. Okay. The Western U.S. has the potential to build a more resilient, yada, yada. It does that. And then it goes into, and if we're able to shift towards a more ecologically based approach, then we can create yada, yada. So it's picking these things up as we go along and incorporating into it. Now, here's the really cool part here. And this is what's really exciting and fun looking at ChatGPT, is that I took all that material then, and that's getting pretty close to a good graph for the and thing, but it's just too clunky and too long. And so I give it this command. Now repeat that material, but reduce the optimistic element to 15 words. I think previously it was maybe 30 or so. And says, sure, balanced approach to fire management can create a resilient and sustainable future for the Western U.S. So that might not be perfect, but it's pretty close. And what you can do, okay, now, do that again, only this time add this one little bit. You can fiddle with it and manipulate it and use it as a tool to rapidly give you drafts in which you know where you're going. If you do know where you're going, if you know what you're headed for, then this is this rapid variation generator for you. And eventually, I got to the bottom here, and then I took all that stuff and shaped it into the way I would like an ABT to start for this issue of fire suppression. Probably something like this. A balanced approach to fire management can create a resilient and sustainable future for the Western U.S. And if we shift towards ecologically based fire management that reduces the risk of catastrophic fires, then communities will be better adapted to living with fire, and wildfires will be more manageable. But at the moment, this isn't happening because, and then you go on from there. This is what's involved in building a good, powerful ABT that gets to the core of what you're wanting to say. But that becomes your big problem, is it doesn't work if you don't know what you want to say. And if you don't know what you want to say, then you are doomed no matter what you do. And if you somehow think that you can just have this thing tell you what you want to say, that ain't going to work. You've got to develop this knowledge of your field. And then when it comes to form, you have to develop narrative intuition. That's what you get from getting trained with this ABT structure. And the more you work with it, the deeper you get a feel for it. And, one of our best guinea pigs in all of this is my friend Park Howell, who's had 10 years now. And I've listened to him for 10 years. And 10 years ago, he was at the primary stage of the 3 words. Hey, these 3 words are great. Nowadays, he's as deep into it as all of us because he's taught one of the 4 guest lectures in the course for probably about 20 rounds now. And we're all on this journey together. And that's pretty much, I will stop sharing with that.
Let's bring you back in here. The interesting thing about that, Randy, is I was not there in the course when you did this with the Forest Service. Were you just kind of winging it, or did you already have the prompts in mind that you were going to use to do that?
I only did 3 things with them, but I did it in real time, which was that first draft, give us an ABT. And then I pointed out to them, and actually I had them, what's wrong with what it's done here? And everybody in the chat window started typing in. It started with the problem. Once you've done the course, and this was like the next to last session for the course. So they'd already done 8 hours of ABT training, plus their working circles outside of that, yada, yada. And by that point, they all had the beginnings of deep narrative intuition, which is they have this sense that it's not going to work if you start with the problems. If all you're doing is yelling at people, everything's going wrong, you're not going to compel anybody to get involved in anything. So they all spotted that instantly. And then based, on that, I said, great, now we're going to go to step 2, which is I'm going to ask it to be optimistic there at the beginning. And that's kind of a crude command. There's more fine tuning you can do than that, but that was enough to get it to drop the problems and go with the vision of the future a little bit. And then I think I did the if then, and then and then they all spotted that. Well, wait a second. It gave you an if then, but now it's trying to start the and with the word if. You don't start an ABT
it's because they knew it. They've been building their narrative intuition. And it's a little bit, I equate it to I like to play golf. I suck at it. And quite often I hit these slices, and I can go into ChatGPT, but I know the foundation of golf. I know my swing and whatever. Hey, how can you help me clear my slice? And it comes up here, the 3 main causes for a slice. Go and practice doing this. And then you got to go actually out and do it and have an understanding for the form, having understanding for the content of the swing and so forth, and then physically do it over and over again. And I don't see ChatGPT or any AI replacing that anytime soon. I don't.
Well, but
people are saying to you, your business is dead, Randy Park. You better be concerned because ChatGPT is going to teach all this stuff. No, it won't, because you as a human being, Homo sapien, you have to understand where you're going and what you're going to ask it to do.
But that said, again, time is the big variable, and that's the gift that it's giving us. And on your golf swing, it won't be long before they'll have video cameras all over the course there and feeding it into the AI that will then have an earplug in your ear that will be telling you, Park, you need to move your hand a little to the left. It will be coaching you very soon like that. It'll take away all that time that you would have had to go to a computer and type it all in.
No, you know what it's going to actually tell me? It says, Park, you seem frustrated right now. Take 3 weeks off and then quit. That's what my AI is going to tell me.
Perfect.
Anyway, last thing here, and let's wrap this up.
Yeah.
You had gotten an email from one of your other colleagues about this idea of garbage in, garbage out, and you had a little experience with that today too before this call. And I think it's really important to talk about because, again, it goes back to look at, as humans, we're not going to give our total agency to ChatGPT. You got to do this stuff and learn it yourself.
Wait, GPI?
You can use it
as
as a
GPT.
GPT. Sorry about that. See, I'm already.
Is that a new version? Right.
But use it as the tool because it's a really, really powerful opportunity to get you through these variances. But
there is exactly that dynamic, precisely. And right now, as we know, this morning I was on a Zoom call with about 6 or 7 of the people in our ABT group. And we started playing a game that we called Balk or Bullshit. And you type in commands to ChatGPT and then see what it does. Will it balk and say, sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. I have no expertise in that. Or will it bullshit? I would encourage all your listeners to play around to that with their friends. Balk or bullshit with ChatGPT. Ask it these things. This is what we did was, we said, a friend had sent this thing where they typed in using Randy Olson's ABT framework, this and this and this. And then we typed in using John Johnson's narrative framework, address this thing. And it didn't hesitate. It didn't say, I don't know of a John Johnson's framework. It said, using John Johnson's narrative framework, we know that this works like this, this, and this. And it was just, bullshitting, basically. So that is, again, why, at least in these stages right now, you really need to know what you're looking for and know what the thing is. And once you've got narrative intuition, the form that is really powerful and how to tweak that. And you can drive this thing. But I think the final thing for me to say, wrapping it all up, was that since the start of the year, I've been in some of my talks, I put up a slide of a race car and I say, ChatGPT is like this really fancy race car that drives super fast and it's so impressive, but it's still got to have a steering wheel. That's what narrative structure is. You've got to know narrative structure. That's your steering wheel. And if you don't know that, if you don't have any narrative intuition, you don't know what you're looking for, and you're just dazzled with yourself as this thing goes all over the place. And at the end of the day, it amounts to nothing. And you can do that. You can burn up all this time with ChatGPT and have it amount to nothing if you don't know what you're looking for. But if you do, it can be very productive. And
know how to steer the darn thing. I guess there's a whole industry now around prompt engineering. Someone's even selling you on a 6-month course on helping you communicate with AI so you actually get something of use out of it.
Well, and there's the warning on dazzlement, and unfortunately, entirely too much of our society buys into dazzlement. This is the burden that you and I have carried with the ABT, which is discrimination against simplicity. And you show up with this 3-part tripartite structure that is simple at its core. It has a fractal dimension to it, but that's not enough to overcome their need and desire for complexity and dazzlement. And so many people are more than happy to have a great big fat book that they'll never read, but is dazzling to look at, as opposed to the people that we work with that we're getting selected for. They're out there. This is what's emerged with the training course that we do, which is I began to realize last few months, wait a second, every group we're working with is in the trenches doing stuff in the real world. We're not, the people that are out there theorizing they don't have any urgency and they don't see this as a very useful thing. So this is really increasingly more of a approach for people that are actually trying to do things in the world. And they're the ones that are so thankful and appreciative. I'm sure that's got to be the deal. I mean, there's not a lot of, probably the theoreticians in your business world wouldn't be that interested in it. They want some big multi-level complicated model, blah, blah, blah. We're just working with the real people that are trying to do things. Simplify.
So you've gone through the initial earthquake of ChatGPT.
Yes.
You've grabbed your colleagues and some of your students and some of your detractors by the arms, shaking them, bruising them, saying, oh my God, what do I do now? What do we do now, Randy, with ChatGPT and the ABT?
We first off accept that core principle. You don't know what you're doing if you don't know what you're looking for. I think that is the overriding principle right now for everybody to be aware of. You don't know what you're looking for, then you're just going to get lost in the world and be led around by the nose on these things. It's more important than ever. From the beginning, we've had this catchphrase with everything we've done with the ABT, which is that narrative is leadership. And that becomes the fundamental question. Do you want to lead on things? Do you want to actually be doing stuff? And leading at every little micro level, whatever that you're doing. Everybody kind of wants to lead, not everybody, but most people. And that's the key thing. Narrative is leadership. So this is now a tool to help you with leadership, but it isn't going to be any value if you don't understand narrative. And so it comes back to the same old thing, which is that you got to put in the time to develop some level of narrative intuition. You get a little bit at the primary level, just learning the 3 words and, but, therefore, but realize that in the books and in the training that we do, there's the secondary level, and that gets better and better each day. I mean, Matt, who's now my co-instructor, he's running the current round of the course. He's developed such a deep narrative intuition that he came up with the Matt template that's really probably the most powerful tool we have of all now, of heaven and heaven, but hell, therefore action. And that's it. It's narrative intuition. If you haven't developed that, then you can't just fill in the blanks in these things. That's what you get is people that, can I just fill in the blanks and communicate effectively? That's one of the sad things that goes on in the science world. The major journals have developed what are called structured abstracts, where they no longer ask you to write your own abstract for them to edit. They give you a fill in the blanks template. Put this sentence here. Tell us what your topic is. Tell us what your thing you studied is. Tell us what you found out. And you can do it robotically like that, but you don't know what you're doing. You've got to understand how narrative works.
Well, and your audience won't care. When you publish that important paper, go for that important grant, or in sales, if you're trying to bring in that important client, if you're doing this by rote and filling in the blanks, it typically is non-narrative, and that Homo sapiens storytelling ape sitting across from you isn't going to give a crap about what you have to say.
They're going to be bored or confused. And
bored and confused. When was the last time you were bored into buying anything, Randy? Right? It doesn't work that way. To me, what is most profound, again, given your background in evolution, is if you as a listener or viewer here want to evolve as a more compelling communicator, understand this ABT and then understand how you can use ChatGPT, as Randy said, to create those variances very quickly and without burning the calories, without burning the energy of having to rewrite, providing you know the structure inside and out. I mean, it is built into you. The and, but, therefore, the if-then clause, the power of the word because in your but statement, the order of your content, the what and the how, which we didn't even talk about.
Yeah, that's all the secondary stuff.
But you've got to be that race car driver, understanding that here first before you could get the race car of ChatGPT to actually take you faster, win the race. Let's really have a very poor pun right here.
Yeah.
But, I guess we've decided it's friend, not foe to the ABT.
Oh, absolutely. You've got to take the initiative, but I would encourage all of your listeners to get onto ChatGPT and realize that you can have a conversation with it. That's when it becomes powerful. Not just asking it a one-off question, write an ABT for me. It's once you start going forward into a conversation. Okay, now do this, now do this, now do this. And it's learning as it's going along. And you can even explain to it, an ABT needs to open with a vision of heaven, of what we see the world that we're going for to be. And it can soak that in. Okay, in that case, here's a draft that does that. And you read that, like, that's getting better. It's that iterative process of interacting with it that I would encourage everybody. Don't pass judgment on it or the ABT until you've engaged in that and been impressed. Like, wow, look at what I can do. I can talk to this thing and it can work as an assistant with me, in which I give an assignment, go off and do this. It only takes 1 second to do the assignment.
Absolutely. Randy, where can people learn more about you and the ABT courses?
abtframework.com. That is our website. That's probably the entry point right there. And there is the connection to the books. And the most important book at the moment is the most recent one, which is the one on science. But don't be chased off by the science label on it, because it really is very broad. And the first few chapters are fairly new, up-to-date rewrite in which we include in there the Matt template and the butt bomb. That's our newest term. And everybody needs to be thinking in terms of butt bombs. That's your core, most powerful tool in all this narrative stuff. And I think, that's probably the best resource.
Yeah. Well, thanks, man. It's really great to have you back on the show. And by God, you got a tie on, for crying out loud. All the other
just for you.
It was that rogue surfer showing up, but now you got the tie. You're looking way too respectable for me.
Just for you, Park. This is to pay you back for the 20-some visits you've done to our course, which has become a fundamental part of the whole course.
Oh, it's been fun. I've learned so much in the process. And Hey, folks, I just want to thank you for being here today. If you're watching this or if you're listening to the show, I am now producing all of our podcasts on video, Zoom or Riverside. I'm still playing between both of them. So if you're listening to the show and you want to see it in action, come on over to YouTube through the show notes. There'll be a link there for you to watch this as well. And if I could be a service to you with the ABT in the business, sales, marketing, leadership world, shoot me a note, park@businessstory.com. And of course, I've got that short online course that you can go in and get a taste of the ABT and actually start applying it immediately. You'll find that at businessstory.com/ABT. And I can't thank this man enough. He's the one that introduced me to the ABT way back when. And he and I, with a number of other people now, have just had a ball going out there and literally training tens of thousands of scientists and academians, business leaders, sales and marketing people, and the emails we get of how it has profoundly impacted their world. These three little words will blow your mind. So check it out, businessstory.com/ABT. And until next week, when we'll have another amazing story artist like Randy Olson here for you, remember that the most potent story you'll ever tell is the story you tell yourself. Right, Randy?
Absolutely.
So make it a great one. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Park. Always a good time.